you that he got your text message? Okay, he got it. We had him busy yesterday cleaning. He's still paying off his football bill.
That's great. Can you come to my house too?
Wow, it just suggested that.
So you clean papers?
Yes. I licked them clean.
Oh, fantastic.
Oh, it's the shepherd. How you doing? I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
I only connect with people based on their role and journey. That's just the easiest way to connect with people. How you been? Still plugging away everything.
Oh, yeah.
But, yeah. Slowly but surely.
Yeah. So is Dad sitting there or here? I don't want another chair. Had a chair. Some of the swap chairs.
Hey Elizabeth, why don't you text Grace the streaming link so she can watch it?
I don't know whether or not she's coming.
I know, but I'm saying if you text her the streaming link, then she can watch it. So she doesn't
I
have to
can
watch it.
try. I don't know if the streaming's gonna work.
I know. You can tell her that. Tell
I
her
know.
it's a possibility, but it's then she'll.
They gave them all tickets, and they went to their teenagers, so they And then there was, we had 5 that were blocking. And the last one, by taking us
Exactly, yeah.
plate recording and sent to me. The last one was still there.
I have a terrible job. I need to go check the stream to make sure I can hear you. Yeah, but you have to stand up.
No, I don't want to stand up here.
Because I told you to.
Well, that makes me sound like I have something important to say.
You do. You're saying, yes, you do. You have something very important to say. Yes, you do. The very important thing you have to say is, I'm checking the audio.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
I'll make mom do it. Wow. Where are you going? Oh, just in there. Okay. Can you hear me? Is that good?
Oh. Oh, is that a web? That's a webcam.
Hello. Oh, you can hear me.
Cool streaming, huh?
I really did enjoy it. What I didn't like is
Seconds later.
Okay, all right, that's good. Thank you, Elizabeth.
So I wanted to tell you this past week, apparently there's a bunch of companies that release awards involved, and our company got 4 golds and a bronze from 3 different groups. No way! And this product I worked on got a gold and a bronze. Yeah. Yeah. I was like, wow.
There's nothing like being recognized by your industry.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, it was amazing. Never had that happen before.
Is there a specific, like, what were the categories?
These companies are so huge that do this. I mean, they've got categories for every slice of the industry.
Yeah.
Although in ours, the other groups that were recognized were like, I think it was one of the Arab countries and their software they wrote for their electrical grid or something, I think. Yeah, so it wasn't anything, I mean, it was pretty broad. The categories are pretty broad. So anyway. Alex! How you doing, man?
Doing great, how are you?
I'm well.
I just actually got ping on LinkedIn. Working with
Okay. I think that's what it was. I think that's what it was. Yeah. I can't, to be honest, it could have been Dubai. I don't know. But they were on a couple of them. Like one of them got a gold medal from one of the groups, and they got a gold medal in the other one too. So they must have some pretty decent stuff going on.
Yeah. You'll take 0.5, 0.2. Oh, I see.
So he's sitting there. I was gonna get him. Oh, she is?
I think he goes and gets food I know. They go get food.
I'll bring them. Look at my pretty present. Awesome?
Yes. It is a Christmas present.
It is actually that one, yeah. Really, Sierra?
So, one of the things that I wrote somewhere, anyway, was that it's not so much like I want to own it, I want it, but sometimes it's just,
Yeah.
too many, thank you.
Yes, too
But,
many customers.
but I do want to ask when we are finally able to connect, if anybody, once I get that exact program name, does anybody have familiar with it?
Yeah.
Because what I literally did is I went over to Joe's house, and I had everything typed, I had all the pictures ready, and
She just helps with the formatting. Well, hopefully, with this happening,
And maybe it's
the
not
program already designed, maybe just.
But I will want more time, so I'm gonna, as soon as that deadline in February, I'm gonna try to have fairly soon after that.
I think that, and we can make it February 2nd.
Well,
February 1st is the deadline to still.
Yeah, but then if somebody applied February 1st, they're still kind of.
Well, but then you can start on, if everybody
Right.
who's already in the committee knows that the deadline is February 2nd.
You know what, it would be easier, in my opinion, for them anyway, because you know, like, it's crazier than
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So just after.
I think it was, for us, it was set for February 12th.
Oh, where was?
With Daniel here, we said it was February 12th.
Okay.
Not the applying for graduation, but have your biography was due February 12th.
But just for the record, it wasn't just, there was some contributions in mine
And
too.
the board has added stuff to the grad guidelines.
So will
I
they,
read it, the board can basically say,
but that's why it wasn't on the report. I sent two of them to, the tall long-haired lady, how come I can't even see it? Thank you, yeah. And she was like,
yeah, exactly.
We're ready? Yep.
All right. Well, good afternoon, guys. Thank you so much for coming out. I really am honored by the Bridge's presence here, as well as everybody else. Thank you, guys. I hope this will be worth your time. So just a couple quick things. So because the microphone that's going to feed the live stream is going through the camera, it picks up a lot of stuff. So if you could try to not make a lot of noise, that would probably be beneficial for those who are viewing us online. Two, if you could save any questions or comments until the end, we'll cut off the live stream and then we'll just do Q&A offline if you have any. So we will try to end by 1:30, be respectful of your time. So let's dive in. Let's pray. Father God, thank you that we can study your word today. And God, for those of you who know you as Savior and Lord, I pray that this would be an encouragement and an equipping time to be able to better explain the reasonableness of Christianity and evidence to others, God, that they would consider the evidence to make a decision. For those who are still examining that evidence for themselves. So I pray that you would help me to explain things clearly, that you would guide their thinking, and that you would reveal yourself to them, God. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I'm not going to wear a mask this week because that did not work well last week, I heard. So I'm just going to try to stay away from you all, since I'm putting more aerosols into the air than anybody. But I do feel well, as far as I know. So, all right, so we're on part 5. Next slide, please. This is a quote I wanted to share last week and I forgot. As we talked about, so last week was part 1 of the reliability of the Bible. We talked about, reliability of the New Testament. And we talked about how the way the Gospels are written clearly indicate that they were written by people who were eyewitnesses or who had access to eyewitness material. They weren't made up after the fact. And I love this quote by Dr. Peter Williams from Tyndale House. The Gospel writers were evidently extremely familiar with the locations they wrote about, while late non-canonical forgeries, so that's like apocryphal writings, apocryphal Gospels, written from outside the area of Palestine seldom mention any city other than Jerusalem, the one famous city that everyone knew was in Israel. The Gospel writers alone include the specific names of lesser first-century towns and villages. The Gospel writers mentioned or described Anion, Arimathea, Bethphage, Caesarea Philippi, Canaan, Chorazin, Dalmathua, Emmaus, Ephraim, Magadan, Nain, Salem, and Sychar. Some of these villages are so obscure that only people familiar with the area would even know they existed. And it's important to note as well, some of the, like one of the earliest known archaeological evidences of one of these ancient cities actually comes from, I believe, Mark. So it's not just the New Testament is corroborated by external outside sources. The New Testament is considered a primary source by scholars. All right, so moving on. So where we've been, so last week, again, we looked at part 1, reliability of the Gospels, and we looked at how the Gospels are shown to be eyewitness material by the use and frequency of names, the disambiguation of names, the distinction between narration and direct speech of names, detailed geographical information, the Jewishness of the Gospels, which later forgeries did not have. We looked specifically at the fingerprint of Jesus that was seen in the massive parables he told, the pinnacle of ethics he gave us with the golden rule. He is the author of creating the golden rule. The Jewishness, again, of Jesus's parables, and the use of the Son of Man, which the title, Jesus' preferred title for himself, but was not used by the later church. A lot of that was taken from Can We Trust the Gospels by Dr. Peter J. Williams. I highly recommend that book. It was a fascinating read. And even though Peter Williams is clearly brilliant, he writes in a very accessible way, so you don't need to know Greek to be able to understand what he's talking about. So just a recap of where we've been. And the reason I keep recapping this is because, as I've said before, and I will keep saying, if you are considering the evidence of Christianity, or if you're making a case for someone to consider the evidence of Christianity, my challenge is, my plea is to consider the whole spectrum of evidence. You can't just look at one piece of it, but to look at the cumulative effect of the whole. That the idea that, and this is what jurors do, right? When, especially in murder cases, even, like they say, okay, for example, okay, we know this woman was beaten to death, and John is a suspect, and John has a baseball bat we found in his bedroom. Okay, well that's probably not enough to send him to the electric chair, right? But then the forensics studied the bat and they discovered that the bat had been cleaned with bleach. Okay, that's a little strange. And we discovered that he owns a jacket and that matches the description of the suspect seen leaving the victim's house. And then we see that he also owns a unusual pair of boots that would match the description of the suspect. We discovered that his car was seen in the vicinity of the area at the time of murder. And so as we keep getting these circumstantial pieces of evidence, it's not going to send this guy to the electric chair. But when we consider if we have like 20 or 30 pieces of evidence like that, the case becomes overwhelmingly convincing that this guy is in fact our suspect. He is the murderer. And so what, again, I would encourage anyone to do as they're examining Christianity is to look at all of the evidence. Because maybe you could say, well, you know, any one of these individuals I don't find convincing, or I can find an alternative explanation to. But can you find a reasonable explanation to the sum of it, the whole of it? And again, Christianity is not proven by a mathematical formula. Okay, here's the evidence. Like, it's not like the fundamental theorem of calculus. You know, I remember learning that in school. I was so excited about it. I wanted to frame newsflash. Hopefully you know that. But all we have is copies of copies of copies, and so that raises the question: how do we know we have an accurate copy? That's a very good question, very fair question, and you need to know the answer to it. So we'll be talking about that. And this is insightful not just for the Bible, but the ancient documents we have, whether it's the Bible or Greek mythology or writings of Plato, Aristotle. All the stuff we have from antiquity is copies of copies. And so understanding how we got those copies and how we can know they're reliable is important, not just for looking at the Bible, but for actually appreciating anything from ancient history. And it's also going to be interesting, we'll talk more about the reason we have so much stuff from other ancient societies is actually because of Christians. But we'll talk about that more next week. So, and we'll talk about week 2, modern translations are reliable. We'll specifically get into the King James only controversy. Who's familiar with that controversy? So about half of you are familiar with that there's people who argue that King James is the best English Bible. Some would argue that it's the only reliable Bible. Some of even extreme argument would say it's the only Bible, period. No matter what language a person speaks, they should learn English and then learn the King James. I have actually heard that. And then finally, we'll look at the Bible itself authenticating as the climax of all this. All right, next. All right, so we want to ask ourselves, do we have eyewitness accounts? Are the eyewitnesses reliable? Are they telling the truth? Those are kind of the 2 questions we'll look at. And finally, third question, do we have an accurate copy? That's next week. Finally, what explanation makes the best sense of the evidence? And we'll get to that. We'll end with that today. All right, so let's look at the gospel. So just specifically focusing on the writers of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul, Jude, James. How do we know that they're trustworthy? This is an absolute question you'd ask in a court of law, right? If you're a juror on a murder trial, you would ask, are these eyewitnesses trustworthy? Can we rely on them? Because you're making a life or death decision based on their testimony. And I would say, yes, they are trustworthy. How can we see that? One, their basic storylines corroborated by ancient non-Christian sources. We'll talk about that in just a second in more detail. So both in ancient writings and ancient artifacts. The writings we have, the things we've dug up, validate, verify what they've said. We looked at a lot of that last week, like just 84 points that have been archaeologically verified from just the book of Acts alone. And we could go on into more stuff from John and other Gospels that's been archaeologically verified or has been verified in the ancient writings. They have no reasonable motivation to lie. This is really important. So in his book, Cold Case Christianity, and I finally finished it. Thank you, Dave Snell, for recommending this to me. I really enjoyed this. This was one of the most, probably a really fresh approach to apologetics in recent days. J. Warner Wallace was an atheist, and he's a homicide detective. He specializes in cold cases, investigating murders that have gone cold and they haven't been able to solve, and he picks up those cases and investigates them. And in the process, he started examining, he realized, well, Christianity is really the ultimate cold case. He had a colleague who kept bugging him to come to church with him, so encouragement to everyone to keep inviting friends to church. And so finally he felt like, well, I have to go. He's my former officer, he's a fellow officer. For some reason he felt obligated to go. So he goes to church with this guy. And first thing that struck him was I think the pastor was preaching out of Mark. And he was struck by, hey, this Jesus has some really wise things to say. Like, this actually is helpful for life, just on a pragmatic level. And then he started realizing, okay, Christianity is the ultimate cold case. And as he started examining the Gospels, it struck him that the testimony he was reading, he started applying all the tests he uses as a detective to verify is an eyewitness reliable, is it accurate? And ultimately, his search led him to the conclusion that Christianity was true, the Gospels were accurate eyewitness testimony. So I encourage you to read that. It's a good book if you're interested. You wanting to go deeper, because I'm certainly not covering everything in these seminars. I'm only giving you a high-level overview. But in that, Warner Wallace talks about as somebody who's investigated many murders, many crimes. He talks about there's basically 3 motivations for committing crimes. If I remember correctly, it's 1 would be like money or gaining something. 2 would be like crimes of the heart, right? So passion, sex, and something like that is a motivation. And thirdly, power. He said, broadly speaking, all crimes that are committed fall into one of these 3 motivations. And what we see, we'll look at this a little bit more later on today, but the apostles lack these. Like, they don't have any of these motivations. And this is something jurors take into account, right? If somebody has no reasonable motivation to commit a crime, that's a strong argument that they probably are not the culprit. So we're going to see that the apostles had no reasonable motivation to lie. And again, I'm going to keep using the word reasonable because Many people have argued, okay, the resurrection isn't true, the gospel is not reliable. So there's plenty of people who say that. So it's not like, oh, everybody believes this. Many people will say that they're not true, and they come up with alternative explanations. Well, any of us can come up with alternative explanations, and we're going to look at some of those here at the end. But we have to ask, what is reasonable? Okay, I can come up with, an explanation. There's currently a nail in my tire. It's slowly going flat. But it's going slowly, so I've been able to put air in it, and it'll go 5 weeks, and then I have to put air in again. I can come up with all sorts of explanations. How did that nail get in my tire? Did my neighbor, just get mad at me, drive a nail in my car? Well, no, I don't have any reason to believe that. My neighbors, for all I can tell, like me and are happy to have me as their neighbor, and they've even expressed that. So, that's not a reasonable explanation. Is it theoretically possible? Sure. We can come up with all sorts of explanations of how there's a nail in my tire. Probably the most reasonable explanation is there was a nail on my garage floor or on the road somewhere and I ran over it, right? That's more plausible than aliens came down and inserted the nail into my tire because they had nothing better to do after traveling through interstellar space. So again, what is reasonable? And finally, the willingness to suffer and die for their testimonies is strong evidence that they were telling the truth. We'll talk about that more here in a second too. Okay, so again, back to non-Christian sources that mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. So there's 10 sources that mention Jesus outside the Bible. These are all non-Christian. Some of them are anti-Christian. I'm going to read a couple quotes to you and you'll see that. Josephus, a Jewish historian, he was one of the people who survived the revolt against Rome. All his compatriots committed suicide. He's like, I think I'll surrender instead. And so he surrendered to the Romans and became very well received. He wrote a history of the Jews. Tacitus, a Roman historian, I'm going to read a quote from him in a moment. Pliny the Younger, I'm going to read from him as well. He was a Roman governor. Phlegon, a freed slave, who wrote history. Stalus, a first-century historian. Suetonius, a Roman historian. Lucian, a Greek satirist. Celsus, a Roman philosopher. Marabar Seppion, a private citizen who wrote to his son. And the Jewish Talmud are all sources outside of the Bible that point to the basic storyline of the New Testament. Can you skip ahead of the slide? No, go one more slide. Okay, so here's a summary of what we can deduce from these 10 sources. I'm going to go back to those slides in a second. So again, not using the Bible at all, here's the basic storyline you get from these ancient sources that talk about Jesus. Number 1, he lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. 2, he lived a virtuous life. He was known as someone virtuous. 3, he was a wonder worker, so he had a reputation for performing miracles. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah, the one the Jews had been looking for hundreds of years and had been prophesied to come for hundreds and hundreds of years. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover. Darkness and an earthquake occurred when he died, which is also recorded in the Bible. His disciples believed that he rose from the dead. Now, again, they're not saying that he actually did rise from the dead. These ancient sources, because otherwise they'd be Christian, right? These ancient sources are saying his disciples believed that he rose from the dead. And we'll talk about that in more detail. So did they have the reason to believe he rose from the dead? His disciples were willing to die for their beliefs. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and finally, his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshipped Jesus as God. All right, can you go back up? So again, doesn't that strongly parallel the basic storyline of the Gospels? And again, we're not touching the Gospel. This is ancient, non-Christian, or even anti-Christian sources that are corroborating the basic storyline of the Gospel. So any of the far-fetched theories about Jesus is just a legend, he's just made up, it's not real, or some of these stories, or you've seen Zeitgeist on the internet, which is just awful, and you notice they don't document any of their sources in that. You shouldn't believe something just because it's on the internet. Just saying. So the basic storyline of the Bible is verified outside of the Bible. So any idea that Jesus was legendary or just made up, or he's just a retelling of a pagan mythology of a God who died and rose again, doesn't line up with history. Nobody who knows anything about history would believe that. So I want to give you a sampling of what these people, these ancient sources said. So here's a quote from Josephus. It's one of the kinder quotes. He says, at this time, referring to the time of Pilate, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Again, amazing correspondence to Scripture. And Josephus probably has some of the details better because, being a Jew, he was much more familiar with the prophecies and expectation of the coming Messiah of his people. Next slide. Now, let me give you a couple quotes that are not so flattering. Again, Josephus was not a Christian, but was a little more kind to them. This is what Tacitus wrote about Christianity. And notice his description of Christianity. He calls it a disease. Not flattering. But neither human help nor gifts from the emperor nor the ways of placating heaven could stifle scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order of Nero. So he's referring to the fire in Rome. Therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd called Christians. He's got a nifty footnote here explaining the misspelling. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the region of Tiberias by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment. Notice again, he calls it a pernicious superstition. Was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital Rome itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and become fashionable. First, then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the account of arson as for hatred of the human race. Wow, that's how we're described, hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle, and gave an exhibition in his circus, mixing with the crowd in the clothes of a charioteer or mounted on his chariot. Hence, in spite of a guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, referring to the Christians deserving to die, there arose a sentiment of pity due to the impression that they were being sacrifices, not for the welfare of the state, but for the ferocity of a single man. So again, not a complimentary description, not a friend of Christianity, or calls us a disease, calls it a pernicious superstition. Yet, what is he implicitly corroborating? The basic storyline of the New Testament, that there's this rumor about that Jesus rose from the dead, and that Jesus was really crucified under Pontius Pilate. Listen to what Pliny the Younger writes, and he's writing to the emperor about. He's like, "How do I handle these Christians?" And it's kind of chilling to just read this of how he writes to the Emperor Trajan for advice on how to deal with Christians. He says, "It is my rule, sir, to refer to you all matters of which I am unsure. For who is more capable of guiding my uncertainty or informing my ignorance? Having never been present at any trial of the Christians, I am unacquainted with the method and limits to be observed either in examining or punishing them. I have also been in great doubt whether any difference is to be made on account of age, or any distinction allowed between the youngest and the adult, whether recanting allows a pardon, or whether if a man has once been a Christian, it does not help him to recant, whether the mere profession of Christianity, albeit without crimes, or only the crimes associated with it, are punishable. In the meanwhile, the method I have observed towards those who have denounced me as Christians is this. I interrogated them about whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question a second and a third time, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be led off to execution. For whatever the nature of their belief might be, I could at least feel no doubt that stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy deserved punishment. There were others also possessed with the same madness, but being citizens of Rome, I directed them to be sent there." And that would line up with what we see happens to Paul in the book of Acts, that he gets to go to Rome for trial as he appeals to Caesar. These accusations spread from the mere fact of the matter being investigated, and several forms of the mischief came to light. A placard was put up without any signature accusing a large number of persons by name. Those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation to the gods and offered adoration with wine and incense to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the image of the gods, and who finally cursed Christ, all things it is said that no real Christian can be forced to do, I thought they should be discharged. Others who were named by that informer at first confessed themselves Christians, but soon after denied it, saying that they had been, but they had ceased, some 3 years earlier. Many years ago, and a few as much as 20 years ago, they all worshipped your statue and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. They affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, and of singing in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and of binding themselves by a solemn oath not to wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor to deny a pledge when they were called upon to deliver it. After this, it was their custom to separate, and then reassemble to partake of food. But food of the ordinary and innocent kind. Even in this practice, however, they had abandoned after the publication of my edict, by which, according to your orders, I had forbidden political associations. I therefore thought it was more necessary to extract the real truth with the assistance of torture from 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I could discover nothing more than depraved and excessive superstition. Chilling, isn't it? But again, an affirmation of the beliefs of the early church. That they worshiped Jesus as God, they accepted him as God, they wouldn't worship the Romans, they were committed to virtuous lifestyles, telling the truth, not committing fraud, not committing adultery. Alright, so moving on. So we've looked at these, so basic corroboration of the New Testament storyline through these ancient sources, non-Christian sources. Keep going in. Oh, sorry, go back. Where were we? Okay, so there's top 10 reasons. Again, I feel like I'm really not doing this subject justice. This is an overview. I'm hoping that if you want to go deeper, it'll drive you into the books that I've recommended. But, so top 10 reasons, Norman Geisler and Frank Turek in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, talk about 10 reasons to believe the Gospels. Number 1, the Gospel writers include embarrassing details about themselves. We've talked about this in the earlier lessons, but it's worth mentioning. Our natural human tendency, if we describe ourselves, is to say good things about ourselves. You look at that when people write their biographies or autobiographies, they tend to mention the good things and not mention the bad things, and minimize those. I think of one celebrity that I will not mention by name, whose biography I read many years ago, and then was later on accused of some very heinous crimes. And I was like, you didn't mention that in your book. So that's our natural human tendency, but and we all relate to that. We can all say, agree to that. That our tendency is to minimize our own failures. Yet in the Bible, the apostles, the disciples, look really bad over and over again. It describes their failures. It describes unbelief. It describes cowardice. It describes failures, disobedience to Jesus. Especially Mark. I mean, Mark is hard on them. That just over and over again, the disciples don't get it. The disciples don't get it. So it's not complimentary. And even after the resurrection, Peter fails, has to be publicly rebuked by Paul. You think of at the arrest of Jesus, all the disciples flee. One person runs away naked, which is just a picture of utter human failure. Running away naked from your enemies that is the picture of shame and failure. And so it's not complimentary to the disciples and apostles. And so it begs the question, if they're making this up, why would they describe themselves so badly? The fact that they are willing to describe themselves so honestly testifies to their integrity and their honesty, that they're committed to telling the truth, even if it makes themselves look bad. Number 2 includes embarrassing details and difficult sayings of Jesus. Again, if you're trying to promote a new religion, you want to have everything looks great. You want it to be like a political campaign where you are just wonderful in every way. And there's some places in Jesus where there's things that are difficult to understand, that we still struggle with. What did he mean by that? There's places where it says and because of unbelief, Jesus could not perform many miracles there. Well, that's could be considered kind of a bad thing for Jesus. That's not points for Jesus, right? But they included all these things. They included the demanding sayings of Jesus. I mean, if you're going to make up a religion, make up something that you can keep. Make up a standard of conduct that is keepable. But what did Jesus teach? I mean, just reading in Luke the other day. Just read this for you. Go through Luke's and my talks right now. And every time I read through this passage, it's just man, am I even doing? Jesus says, "But I say to you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from the one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to expect to get back the same amount. But love your enemies, and do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. It's like, man, do I do that? You know, like, I'm trying, this is, and we could go on and on. I mean, there's really hard stuff. And I mean, Jesus, the teachings of Jesus raised the bar to a standard of ethical conduct that nobody can keep. His standard is unbelievably high. Why would you include that standard, a standard that you yourself couldn't even keep, if you're trying to make up this following of Jesus? Number 4, they carefully distinguish Jesus' words from their own. And so if you're not very familiar with the Bible, like there's places where, like in Corinthians, Paul will say something about not the Lord doesn't say this, but I say this, when he's trying to resolve questions they're asking or conflicts within the church. In Acts, you look at Acts 15, there's this big controversy in the early church about, well, do we require circumcision or not? What do we do with that? Well, if you're just making up a religion, the easiest way to solve problems like this is just to write in something like, well, Jesus said this. Okay, boom, problem solved. But they didn't do that. Instead, they wrestled with things that Jesus didn't talk about, which again indicates they're committed to accurate witnessing. They're committed to telling it like it is. And if Jesus didn't speak to an issue, they don't just make something up and put it in Jesus' mouth to solve their conflict or solve the controversy. They're careful to distinguish Jesus' words from their own. They include events about the resurrection that they would not have invented. Who were the first witnesses to the resurrection? The women. Yeah, now, we don't have a problem with that because we believe, as the Bible teaches, that men and women are equal in God's image. But in first century Judaism, it was a very sexist society right there. Like a woman's testimony could just even be considered inadmissible in court. Like, oh, a woman's going to testify? Oh, we can't trust her. Like, it's bad, right? It's really bad. So if you're making up something, why would you have women be the first witnesses? Like, that doesn't help your case. It doesn't strengthen your argument. But if the women were actually the first witnesses to the resurrection, then you would include it. And other details as well that they would not have invented. Next one, number 6, they include at least 30 historically confirmed public figures in the writings, whether it's the line of Herod or Pontius Pilate or Felix. So there's various political figures, historical figures confirmed. That gets dangerous. If you're making something up to bring in people of power and prestige and put their names and put in accounts about the things they said or did and put that into your writings, if those things didn't take place, you are setting yourself up for a trip to jail or execution. Especially, we're not talking about a modern American democracy where you can say whatever and there's kind of no consequences for that. If you are making things up about high political officials and rulers, you could be really in big trouble. Number 7, they include divergent details. If you look at the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, they all agree on the big picture. Okay, the tomb was empty. Jesus rose from the dead. They differ on some of the middle-sized details. One Gospel writer records there were 2 angels. One says there was 1 angel. And they'll differ in some of the middle-sized details. And then on the small, some of the really minute details, they'll agree. Now that's stunning. For example, like one of the Gospels, Jesus says to, I think it was Mary, don't hold me now. I've got to go back to my Father. And there's another Gospel that records something similar about basically not grabbing hold of me, but it's not said in the quite exact same way, so it's a minute detail, but it lines up. And this is exactly, and J. Warner Walls talks about this in great detail and explains it very helpfully in his book. This is exactly what detectives expect from authentic eyewitness testimony. They're going to have they might agree. This is actually a testimony to its faithfulness because different testimonies, different eyewitnesses see and mention different things. If 4 of you witnessed a car accident out here, and then immediately the police show up, and you guys don't get to talk to each other, and we separate all 4 of you, and we interview and say, okay, tell me what you saw. Are the accounts going to be the exact same? No. You're going to probably mention, if you're really into cars, you're going to mention, oh yeah, it was an 86 Honda Accord hatchback. And maybe the other person's not going to mention that at all. They don't care. They didn't even pay attention to what the make of the model of the car was. You're going to mention different details. You're going to agree on the big stuff. And the divergent details is evidence that it's actually authentic. And that divergent details, again, doesn't mean contradictory. That can be reconciled. Right? For example, taking the angel example again. Well, one gospel writer talks about an angel being the two. Another one person says there was two angels. Well, the first writer didn't say there was only one angel. He just talks about one of them. So that's not a contradiction, but it is divergent, right? So, but those divergent details can be reconciled. Number 8, so checking out the verifiable facts, even facts about miracles. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, he's like, more than 500 people witnessed the resurrection. Most of them are still alive. Some people see that even like kind of just putting it out there. Hey, you want to know this is true? Go ask somebody. Like there's hundreds of people still left alive. Also, when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he talks about miracles he had done in their midst. Well, if you're going to write that, you actually have to have done miracles, right? Like if I can't say, hey, man, do you remember that time that I raised somebody from the dead a few years ago? You're like, I don't think I was here that Sunday, right? Like, you're just giving what you sold the farm. If I talk about, oh, this miracle that happened and it didn't happen, my credibility is blown. Paul does the same thing in the Galatians. He talks about miracles that happen among them. Number 9, they describe miracles like other historical events with simple, unembellished accounts. For time's sake, I won't read it, but I don't have enough faith in an atheist. He reads one of the he quotes one of the apocryphal Gospels. I think it's the Gospel of Peter. It talks about the resurrection account. And it's crazy. It talks about like a cross, a talking cross came out of the tomb. And like there was a head that stretched up into heaven. Like, it was like, what? Like, this is silly. The Gospels don't describe miracles that way. They talk about miracles in simple, unembellished accounts. Number 10, they abandoned their long-held sacred beliefs and practices, adopted new ones, and did not deny their testimony, their persecution, or threat of death. Remember, the Jews believed, from childhood, they believed we are God's chosen people. God has revealed himself to us. Everybody else is pagan. And we have the law from God. And so for a Jew to abandon that, to go to something radically different, is rather remarkable. Also, Judaism enjoyed legal protection in the Roman Empire. It was a recognized religion. Christianity was not. So when you go from Judaism to Christianity, you are put in your place where you are losing your legal rights. You are open to persecution, to execution, to torture. So again, this dramatic transformation that happens. Some people say, well, we can't believe what the converted write. And that's really a false, think about it, we don't do that in any other area of life. The question is not, are they converted? The question is, why did they convert? And in fact, converted people can often be the most committed to telling the truth. World War II history is one of my hobbies, one of my favorite subjects. And if you read some of the accounts from survivors of the Holocaust, talk about passion, right? To record details. You think of Knight, that book by a survivor of the Holocaust. There's this their great passion to describing in detail and recording accurately all the things that the Nazis did because they were so horrible and they were committed that they wanted the world to know about that. And so in that case, their conversion to being anti-Nazi, if you will, was motivated, drove them to meticulously record what happened. All right, moving on. Dr. Gary Habermas rightfully says, skeptics must provide more than alternative theories for the resurrection. They must provide first-century evidence for those theories. We're going to get to, in just a second, looking at the alternative theories for the resurrection. And again, it's not just enough to come up with a theory. You have to come up with evidence from the first century to support your theory. Now, if you survey the range of biblical scholars, from the range of Bible-believing, wholehearted, 100%, we're all in Christians, to agnostic, atheist scholars of the Bible. And there are people that, I know that seems maybe strange to some of you, but there are many people who are atheists or agnostics who are actually biblical scholars. And Bart Ehrman's one of them, John Dominic Crossan, there's plenty out there. So if you surveyed the kind of the gamut of biblical scholars, most of them would agree on these points. Even those who don't really believe the Bible, who aren't Christian, they would agree to this. So again, pointing back to the fact that Jesus is not mythology, he's not legendary. They would agree, one, Jesus was died by a Roman crucifixion. So of course, implicit to all this is that Jesus was a real person. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. He was buried most likely in a private tomb. Now this is the one that there may be the most disagreement on. About 75% of scholars would agree to this one. He was buried most likely in a private tomb. The rest enjoy almost unanimous support. Number 3, soon after his crucifixion, the disciples were discouraged, bereaved, and despondent, having lost hope. Number 4, Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his interment. Number 5, the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the resurrected Jesus. Number 6, due to these experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. They were even willing to die for their belief. 8, the proclamation of the resurrection took place very early from the beginning of church history. So in other words, it wasn't legendary material that arose after 20, 30, 50, 100 years. Oh, this is a mythology that's developed. Just like, and that goes back to the eyewitness's account, because, you know, if somebody tried to make the claim, hey, Martin Luther King Jr. Was assassinated and then he rose from the dead, I'm like, time out, you know, there's too many people left alive who would say that's not true. Or if you try to deny Martin Luther King Jr., like, hey, Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't even a real person, this is just made up. You know, you could think of maybe some of these crazy white supremacist groups, you know, maybe saying something like that. You say, or people do this right with the Holocaust, right? There's Holocaust deniers. It's like, oh, the Holocaust didn't happen, that's not real. Well, we have photos, you can go visit Auschwitz. We have, you know, numerous testimonies that have been recorded either in video or audio or in books. There's still people left alive who survived the Holocaust. There's just way too much evidence to say that's plausible. And I would argue the same thing is true of Christianity and resurrection. Like, you couldn't just make this up shortly after the death of Jesus. Finally, the disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. Now, if you're going to make up a legend, if you're going to make up a lie, the place to start it is not in Jerusalem. You know, go to Greece, go to Athens maybe, where people believe in a pantheon of gods, and maybe they'd be more believable to the idea of some God who came to earth and then rose from the dead. But why would you start in the very city where Jesus was crucified? That's a hard sell to argue that he rose from the dead, unless he really did. The gospel message centered on the preaching and death and resurrection of Jesus. Again, this is what Bible scholars agree about. Sunday was the primary day for gathering and worship. Well, that's a huge shift theologically, right? Because the Jews, the Sabbath was holy. This Saturday, the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, that was the holy day. And for the early church to shift to worshiping on Sunday showed that something very significant, going back to them abandoning their long-held beliefs and practices. James, the brother of Jesus and a skeptic before this time, was converted when he believed he also saw the risen Jesus. Just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul, and just so you know, a lot of people talk about, oh, he was Saul, then he became a Christian, became Paul. This doesn't make you any more spiritual to know this, but Saul was his Jewish name, Paul was his Roman name. So it's not like he had a name change. He just had two names. So anyway, just random fact. So just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. Peter Kreeft asked this question: why would the apostles lie? If they lied, what was their motive? What did they get out of it? What they got out of it was misunderstanding, rejection, persecution, torture, and martyrdom. Hardly a list of perks. Okay, we already talked about this one. Go to the next one. All right, and so what happened to early church leaders, the apostles, as one of the other leaders who wrote the Gospels? Andrew was crucified in Greece. Bartholomew flayed to death in Armenia. James the Just was thrown from the temple and beaten to death in Jerusalem. So James the Just would have been the half-brother of Jesus. James the Greater, this would have been the brother of John, so James and John, sons of thunder. He was beheaded in Jerusalem. He died early on. His death is recorded in Acts. John is the only one who died a natural death. He died in exile on the island of Patmos. They did try to execute him. It's a fascinating account. They tried to boil him alive in oil, and he didn't die. And so you think that would have been a testimony to them of like, maybe this Christianity thing is true. But instead they just exiled him. Luke was hanged in Greece. Mark was dragged to death by a horse in Alexandria, Egypt. Matthew was killed by a sword in Ethiopia. Matthias was stoned and then beheaded in Jerusalem. gets like the high death count here. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Philip was crucified in Phrygia, and Thomas was stabbed to death in India. Now, again, who would willingly die for a lie? They say, well, objection, there's lots of people that die for a lie. I mean, let's remember 9/11, right? What happened on September 11th, 2001? Muslim terrorists got in a plane, hijacked an airplane, and rammed them into the Twin Towers in New York City. They sacrificed their lives for what they believed. Okay? But they died by faith that their religion was true. They had never seen Muhammad. They did not hear the revelation that Muhammad supposedly received. They died for their religion by faith. It was a step of faith for them that their religion was true. These guys, with maybe the exception of Mark and Luke, died because of eyewitness, because they saw something. They weren't saying, well, we believe this because we heard it, like you and I do. Like none of us have seen the resurrected Jesus, I assume. But they weren't dying for something they believed by faith. They were dying for what they claimed was, what we saw this, we heard it, we've seen it. That John says in the book of 1 John, that which we have seen and heard, we testify also to you. That which we looked upon and have touched with our hands and seen with our eyes, John writes. They were dying for something that if it was a lie, they would have known it to be true. How many people would knowingly die for a lie if they could have saved their life by simply telling the truth? Say, I just kidding, I made it up. Okay, I can't. I mean, naturally. I mean, if you're about to crucify me, and for something that I know to be false, pretty good motivation to suddenly tell the truth. And notice that also that all these guys died in geographically separate areas at different times. So if this was a conspiracy, if they just made this up, hey, let's all get together, we put our heads together, Jesus got crucified, major bummer, it seems like our movement's dead now, what do we do? Okay, let's make up the story that Jesus rose from the dead so we can keep the movement alive. Well, if they're all spread out geographically and by time, is it reasonable that they would keep this conspiracy going? Listen to what Chuck Colson writes about the Watergate conspiracy. How many of us are familiar with Watergate? Ooh, even people who are younger. Okay, good. So the Watergate Scandal, if you might remember, with President Nixon, lost the presidency over that. So this is what Chuck Colson writes about the Watergate Scandal. Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up, perpetuated by the closest aides to the President of the United States, the most powerful men in America who were intensely loyal to their president. But one of them, John Dean, turned state's evidence, that is, testified against Nixon, as he put it, quote, to save his own skin, end quote. And he did so only 2 weeks after informing the president about what was really going on. 2 weeks. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks, and then everybody else jumped ship in order to save themselves. Now, the fact is that all of those around the president were facing was embarrassment and maybe prison. Nobody's life was at stake. But what about the disciples? 12 powerless men, peasants really, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stonings, execution. Every single one of the disciples insisted to their dying breaths that they had physically seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Don't you think that one of those apostles would have cracked before being beheaded or stoned? That one of them would have made a deal with the authorities? None did. And I would argue that the testimony given by these men is stronger than virtually any testimony that we accept in a court of law and we make life and death decisions on. This multitude of men who are willing to suffer and die for their beliefs is strong indication that they were telling the truth. And again, notice they're separated geographically and by time. So if the conspiracy is breaking down, how does Thomas know in India that Peter hasn't already given it up and said, okay, just kidding, it's not like they have email or, the kind of communication we have today. They wouldn't know that the conspiracy was still alive or not. So it'd be even more tempting just to give up, right? We love conspiracy theories, right? Because they make great movies and they make great, episodes in CSI or whatever, crime scene show you like to watch, and they're entertaining, right? But again, J. Warner Wallace talks about this, and I won't go through all his stuff, but in his book, Cold Case Christianity, he talks about, conspiracy theories just really aren't plausible most of the time. He said that the best conspiracy, he said, is a conspiracy with two people, and that after they commit the crime together, one of them kills the other. That's like the best conspiracy. And then so these elaborate theories of conspiracy just are not plausible. That's why I really believe that we landed on the moon in what, 1969 or whatever it was. Some people are like, oh, the moon landing was fake. Okay, well, how many people have had to pull that off? And then nobody's cracked yet. Nobody's said, okay, I'm just kidding, didn't really happen. Conspiracy theories are entertaining, but typically they're not the best explanation for what has happened. All right, next slide. That's it? Oh, okay. All right, so let's talk about the resurrection real quick and brief. One thing I didn't put on the slide, so let me just say it verbally. And C.S. Lewis talks about this in his book, Mere Christianity. Geisler and Church talk about it in their book, I Don't Have No Faith to Be an Atheist. But basically, if Jesus was a real person, which I hope that we've seen that there's overwhelming evidence, there's substantial evidence that yes, he was a real person, that Jesus is real. We have eyewitness accounts, we have his teachings. Then we have to wrestle. There's four possibilities. He was a legend. Well, that's hopefully what you're doing that. We've hopefully seen that no, Jesus was not a legend. He was a real person. He was a liar, which makes him like one of the worst false prophets and religious deceivers of all history. That he's deceiving everybody. But yet, look at his life. It was the paradigm of moral virtue and excellence. In fact, at one point, Jesus even says to his accusers, which one of you accuses me of sinning? Now, I'm never going to get up and say that because anybody who's known me for any length of time can say, we can point out a few things, Charles, that are sinful. That you've done or said. So Daniel knows you went sign the youth group. I've said, Daniel, I tell the youth group, if you're in my youth group long enough, at some point I'm going to have to apologize to you. Because if we go through 6 years of life together, I'm probably going to say or do something that is hurtful or I shouldn't have said or done. So he's not. To believe that he's a liar is not reasonable. Is he a lunatic? Because somebody goes and says, "I'm God." Normally we lock those people up and put them in safe rubber rooms, where they can't harm people. Is he a lunatic? But you read the teachings of Jesus, and as one person said, if only all of us were as sane as he were. So if he's not a legend, if he's not a liar, if he's not a lunatic, the only other option left is that he's Lord. He actually is who he says he was. Again, those arguments goes into more detail in the other books. But Jesus did not leave us open the option of saying, well, he's just a good moral teacher. Jesus didn't leave that option open. Good moral teachers don't claim to be God. Good moral teachers don't claim that they can save you for all eternity and offer you eternal life. All right, so we'll close with this, the evidence for the resurrection. And again, I'm not doing any of these subjects justice. This is just a surface level pass. There is a book that was Case for the Resurrection. Is that right? By Habermas and Lycona. Is that right, Dave? Case for the Resurrection, I think, is the name of the book. So there's multiple books you can go into in more detail on any of these points. And that's one of the things that's really helpful in cold case Christianity is in the back of the book he has a ton of books he lists as you want to go further, you want to research more on the different subjects that he brings up. Okay, so based on, and we already saw these 12 known historical facts that most scholars would agree with, even those who deny Christianity. That's on one page. So on the back, we kind of have this diagram. This is kind of a helpful way of thinking through the resurrection of Jesus. And for those of you who are watching online, this is available online. If you want to get this, just email Barbara in the office and she can send you a link to this. Thank you, Dave, for pointing me to this resource. So which theory best fits the data about resurrection? Again, we want to look what is reasonable. What is reasonable? Okay, well, we have first choice. Either the tomb of Jesus was either occupied or was empty. Okay, well, let's say it was occupied. Okay, it was Jesus' body was still there. Well, there's several then theories, alternate theories of the resurrection that deny that. So there's several pieces of data, and he's got the list here. So one, unknown tomb. Some people say, well, the disciples just went to the wrong tomb. That's one of the arguments against the resurrection. They got confused. Hey, Jerusalem's a confusing place, right? Not good street names or maps, maybe. They went to the wrong tomb. So they're like, oh, it's empty. And they were at the wrong place. Well, there's a lot of data that doesn't explain. Namely 4 through 12 doesn't explain that. And think about it. If they went to the wrong tomb, the Romans and the Jewish authorities, who have every reason to try to squelch this, could just quickly parade the body. Just bring out the body and say, no, he's right here, he's dead. And again, the biggest argument is the disciples did not say, we saw an empty tomb. That was not ultimately why they launched Christianity. It was, no, he encountered the resurrected Jesus. It wasn't just an empty tomb. The wrong tomb, again, similar theory, they go to the wrong tomb. That doesn't count for much of the evidence. Legendary, that doesn't count for any of the things, so it can't be legend. Twin, some people argue, well, maybe Jesus had an identical twin. That violates the empty tomb, and also that the James, the brother of Jesus, who had been a skeptic, right? That's another one of those embarrassing details in the Bible, is that Jesus is rejected by his own family. At one point, they actually come to seize him because they think he's crazy. Again, if you're trying to launch a religious movement, you don't put in details like that. You don't say, by the way, Jesus' family thought he was crazy, at least for a time. That disqualifies that. Hallucination, that's one of my theories, or favorites. Like, people argue, well, it was just this hallucination, either of their grief, or maybe there were some magic mushrooms outside Jerusalem they were eating. There's so many problems with this theory. In The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, he talks about this in detail. He has an interview with a psychologist as part of his journey to faith, because if you're not familiar, Lee Strobel was an atheist who's investigating Christianity. And so one of his interviews with a psychologist is like, look, could this just be some sort of psychological phenomenon explained? And it's like, look, we no, emphatically no. I mean, if I walked in here and said, hey, wasn't that a great dream we had last night? I don't know what you were dreaming about, but, dreams are intensely personal. Well, so are hallucinations. And the idea that 500 people over a 40-day period would have multiple hallucinations that all matched up is beyond believable. And again, the kind of mental craziness for somebody who's living off a hallucination, the apostles don't exhibit any sort of that mental instability. That's just not believable. Existential resurrection. So this is like, well, he didn't really physically rise from the dead. He spiritually rose. But that just, there's a lot of that. Again, they encountered the resurrected Jesus. There was no body. They saw him descend into heaven. Spiritual resurrection. Okay, so the theories that the tomb was occupied, the tomb of Jesus was occupied, none of the theories adequately explain. They're not reasonable. And again, where's the evidence for that? In fact, even into the 1st and 2nd century, maybe the 3rd century, the explanation that was given by the Jews was that the disciples stole the body. What's implicit in that? The tomb is empty, we can't find the body. And it doesn't make sense. Again, who would normally die for life if they stole the body? For one, how did they overcome the Roman guards? And then the fact that they would steal a body and then go out and live and die for a lie, it's not plausible. So let's say they found the tomb was empty. Okay, well, there's two explanations. If you find an empty tomb, it's natural or supernatural. So natural, the disciples stole the body, just talked about that one. Authorities hid the body. Why would they do that? It doesn't make any sense. Because again, they wanted to disprove Christianity. And the best way to disprove Christianity would be to parade the stinking, rotting body of Jesus through the streets of Jerusalem. That would quelch your preaching immediately. Doesn't fit. Doesn't make sense. The swoon theory. So this is the idea that Jesus he just passed out on the cross. He thought he was dead. They put him in the tomb, but he wasn't. He was actually still alive. And so he came back to life. That theory is so bad and just not plausible. If you've read any of the sort of the medical critiques of what Jesus' suffering and crucifixion would have involved, it's just not plausible. For one, he was beaten before he was crucified. Now the beatings, his back would have been basically looked like hamburger meat. It would just been raw, ripped to shreds. Jesus is probably not far from death before he even gets to the cross. The horrific beating, the flogging that he received would have been horrific. And again, the Romans are trained executioners. Like, this is what they do for a living. And so it's kind of insulting to be like, okay, you guys kill hundreds of people, thousands of people, and you don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to do it. They're good at this. And in fact, Scripture records that just to verify that he was dead, they thrust a spear in between his ribs, and out comes what? Blood and water. Now that's interesting. That's kind of weird. Why would you describe that? Well, modern medicine, that's actually an accurate description of what we would expect, right? If it pierced the pericardium, that there would be a watery-like substance lining the heart. And so from the inflamed heart, I've read a couple different medical explanations of this, one by, I think he was an ophthalmologist, another was by a cardiologist. And so blood and water flowing may sound strange, but that's actually what we would expect medically from what Jesus had suffered and endured if you thrust a spear in his side. And there's even an account of somebody who was crucified in ancient history, and for somehow, like his friends or whatever, were able to get a pardon for this guy from the governor or whoever. And so they rush and they take this guy down off the cross before he dies. He still died from the wounds he received. So the idea that Jesus didn't die is just not plausible. That you would take him down, that you would carry him, you would bury him, and he didn't die. And even let's say for just for hypothetically argue, okay, let's say he did die. Is it Jesus who's been beaten and crucified and stabbed? Is he going to convince you that he rose from the dead, that he's the author of life when he appears to you? You know, you're like, get this guy to a doctor, right? You know, like, but again, that's not really even possible. That's not plausible. Passover plot. This was all made up. That Jesus actually concocted this ahead of time. Jesus made this up. Like, okay, I'm gonna get crucified, and then like I'm going to die, and like I'm gonna fake this resurrection. Not plausible. Jesus was an alien.
It's kind of true. It's out of this world.
Yeah, and maybe none of us are actually sitting here right now. Maybe we're all in the Matrix, with the tube shoved down our throat, and we're just thinking this, in the Matrix, Is that possible? Yeah. Is it reasonable? I don't think so. So the most reasonable argument for the explanation of the data, I would argue, is that Jesus rose from the dead, that he came back to life. Some people said, well, look, if he rose, this is incredible. The idea that God would come to earth and die and rise from the dead, like that's incredible. Like I need some incredible evidence to prove that really happened. Well, so what do you mean by incredible? One, do you want another miracle to prove it? Well, because then when does it end? Well, okay, one miracle happened, the resurrection's a miracle. So do I want a second miracle to confirm it? Well, then do I need a third miracle to confirm the second one? Do I need a fourth miracle to confirm the third? Like, where does it end? If you mean lots of evidence you need extraordinary evidence, well, I think we have that. We have more eyewitnesses, more testimony, more evidence to corroborate the New Testament story than we do of anything else in antiquity from ancient times. So I would argue that the case for the resurrection is that the resurrection of Jesus, if you're not coming with a supernatural bias, if you're coming and just looking at the evidence open to all possibilities, if there is a God, which means that if there is a God, then miracles are possible, then the resurrection of Jesus makes the most sense, especially in light of this was prophesied, that for hundreds of years there was a prophecy coming about a Messiah, like that Jesus perfectly fulfills this prophecy. And if miracles are kind of how God's like authenticator, like God's signet ring of like, okay, of proving himself. And that's what we see in the Bible. The Bible's not like just one miracle after the other. Actually, miracles are rare in the Bible. Miracles show up at specific times in the biblical timeline, and they authenticate a message from God. It's kind of like God's way of proving, okay, this is coming from me. And Jesus' resurrection didn't happen in a vacuum. And so the fact that this happened, this was foretold for hundreds of years back, and there's no way Jesus could have concocted all that or even orchestrated all that on his own. I mean, Jesus couldn't make himself be born in Bethlehem to the line of David. That was out of his control. That's a strong argument that, look, if this was prophesied to come and then it actually happened, and then there's evidence that it happened, that's a reasonable explanation that the resurrection actually happened. But I'll close with this, and this is what we'll talk about more in our last session, so 3 weeks from today. We'll talk about the Bible being self-authenticating. Everyone who's a Christian, I don't think you just believe because you've gone through all these alternate explanations, and you're like, okay, that's the most convincing. Though that might have played a part in your becoming a Christian. I think all of you would testify that at some point Jesus became real to you. That as you read the scriptures for yourself, Jesus became real to you. And that's hard to explain, and that's hard to describe, but I would just encourage anybody examining Christianity, or as you are sharing Christianity with others, and I hope all of you who are believers are going to share some of the things you've learned today with other people. Use this week. That would make it much more worth the time it took to prepare this than if you share this with somebody else. But ultimately, urging people to read the Bible for themselves. Start with the Gospels, read the Bibles for themselves. I love Tristan's testimony, how he talks about his coming to faith was through reading scriptures, and then when he went through a season of doubt, about, well, how do I know Christianity is true? You know, I appreciate your honesty there, Tristan. And for you, it was looking at Jesus. It was re-encountering Jesus. And that would be my plea for anybody who's to examine Christianity. Is not just look at the evidence we've talked about, but to read the Bible for yourself, especially the New Testament, and ask God to reveal himself to you. That ultimately, that's what happens when we become a believer in Christ. I don't believe Jesus because of theoretical knowledge. I believe Jesus because I'm encountering him. And I can't prove that to you. And I understand you can say, well, that's really subjective. Fair enough. But it's kind of like, you know, how do I know the sun's bright? Well, I looked at it, you know, and I looked away, or I burned out my retina. I just know. And so and if someone tried to argue, like, that wasn't really the sun, like, it's not really bright. Like, I can't prove it to you, maybe, but I know it's bright. And so just encourage people to read the Bible for themselves. Encourage people, get them a copy of the Bible if they don't have one, to read it for themselves. That's ultimately the test. We'll talk about that more in 3 weeks. So let me pray, and I'll take questions if there's any. Father, thank you for the evidence you've given us. I pray you'd help us to be better at explaining these things, God. And I thank you, God, that we don't believe in spite of the evidence, but we can believe because of it and in light of it. Mm-hmm. And Lord, I pray that you'd help us to get better at this, at explaining the evidence for what we believe, as 1 Peter says, to be able to give a defense to anyone who asks for the reason for the hope that we have. Yes. God, what a hope that there is life beyond this, that there is a better life coming, that there is eternal life with you. Mm-hmm. And Lord, we want others to know that joy. We want others to know you. So I pray that you would help us to explain things, to point them to Jesus. Yes. God, we're a mess, and we thank you that you love us anyway. We thank you that you entered into human history to save us from ourselves, to rescue us, God. And we thank you for the incredible love you have shown us. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.